Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial. It's been a while. How y'all been? Today, we're going to be taking a look at the transforming web shooter effect from Avengers Infinity War. Let me go ahead and show you what we're going to be creating. There you go, nice brief clip, nothing overly complicated. Now there certainly are a lot of ways to do this effect, and I tried to refine it so that way it would be simplest specifically for this tutorial. Now originally it was going to be completely done with Element 3D. However, I ended up taking the route of using a real prop rather than a CG one. Now to follow along, you can either go download my footage from the link in the description, or you can just make your own prop. This one was just made out of some dollar store foam that was sticky on one side, covered in Plasti Dip to make it look more rubberized, which cost about $5 and is really just a sloppy version of a tutorial found on a channel called Odin Makes, link in the description below. So overall, the complexity of our Element 3D usage is going to be kept to a minimum. Now I wanted to do that for two reasons, mainly so it would be easier for people to follow along, but after doing a few tests, it became apparent that the prop version actually ended up looking a lot better. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So here we are in Adobe After Effects. As you can see, I already got my footage in its own composition. Now the first step when creating this effect is actually going to come when you're filming. So if you look right here, my shot goes as follows. I toss my pen cap down at my wrist to simulate the little capsule that holds the web shooter that's going to ultimately transform into what it looks like now. And I turn my wrist over and pretend to shoot the web, just like in the clip from the movie. But I also have another clip shot from the same angle. I went ahead and pulled the web shooter off and tried to match the rotation of my arm, just like in the original clip. And then just for good measure, I have a clean plate of my background where I've moved out of the way just in case I need it. And yeah, I just ordered something off of Amazon, and it was around Easter time, and also I got a new blender. It's a Black & Decker. So now the next thing you're going to need to do is to take your footage of your clean arm that you've matched up with your original and rotoscope out the piece of your arm that would need to cover up the web shooter so that way it's no longer visible. Now, I've already gone ahead and done that just because it's a bit of a lengthy process and I didn't want you guys to have to deal with that, so this is also going to be included inside of the download link if you are following along with my footage. And looking at that overlaid on top of the footage, my arm has no web shooter, and when I turn it over, it just pops on. Now, there's some little issues you can see if you look closely, but the good news is that's all going to be covered up by the web shooter animating onto the arm. So the little imperfections aren't anything to worry about just yet. But starting off this effect, the two things that you're going to need, whether you're working with my footage or your own, is a layer of your original footage with the web shooter already on your arm, and then another layer with the web shooter removed off of your arm. And so you have those two together inside of their own composition, and that is how we're going to get started. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is take your original footage layer and make sure that that's on top of the clean arm layer. That's just what I've named mine, but you can call yours whatever you'd like. And now I'm going to scrub forward in time until just after the pen cap has disappeared off of my arm. So if I shut off my footage layer, I've gotten rid of it right here on this frame. So I'm going to trim my footage layer just to that point, either by dragging it in, or you can use the shortcut Alt open bracket to do that quickly. And now we need to track the movement of my arm. So I'm going to preemptively go ahead and create a new null object. And then with my footage layer selected, I'm going to go to my tracker. If you don't see that, you can go up here to Window and then make sure Tracker has a check mark next to it. And like I said, with the footage layer selected, go ahead and click Track Motion. And I'm going to put this point right here on right about the tip and expand this a bit. And we can go ahead and track forward. So I'm going to go frame by frame for a little just to make sure that we have a solid stick. All right, and that should be enough. We only just needed the first few frames tracked. So we're going to click the Edit Target button, make sure our null that we created, null number 1, is selected, and click OK. And now hit Apply, Apply to X and Y. So now I'm going to go ahead and create a new solid. I'm going to name this Matte and hit OK. And we can parent this solid to the null object, so that way it's going to move along with my arm's movement. I'm going to shut off the visibility for the matte layer now, and we can zoom in here to the web shooter, and on the frame where the footage layer is visible, where we trimmed it to earlier, with matte selected, that's very important, click your pen tool, and we're going to draw a shape right around where the pen cap impacted with the arm. Something sort of like this. And now make sure your matte layer is just above your footage layer. And I'm going to toggle the switches down here and set the track matte of the footage layer to alpha matte. That way it's only going to be visible wherever the matte is. And now here comes the fun part, in my opinion, is we can go ahead and click the matte layer, hit M to toggle open the mask path options, and create a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch right here on the very first frame it's visible. And now we get to go frame by frame throughout this animation and slowly reveal the web shooter onto the arm in a creative way. So I'm gonna zoom in here, hit page down a few times just to move maybe 3 or 4 frames forward. And then we can start expanding this mask. So I'm gonna push it back so it covers the edge, and maybe spread that out so maybe it transformed back and started covering the wrist, and then maybe it moved down a little bit too. And you kind of want to do your best to keep this mask forming to the shape. So imagine that this was sitting straight across the forearm. Obviously it wouldn't be shaped like this or like this. It kind of would be angling up with the direction of the arm. So you kind of want to keep the flowing shape in mind as you're doing this. But again, these imperfections are going to get hidden even further once we start putting in a little bit of Element 3D work. So this doesn't have to be too perfect either. Just do your best and maybe follow along with what I'm doing, maybe throw in some of your own ideas. It's really just up to you and your personal taste at this point. All right, that looks pretty good to me for now, but we can maybe refine that a little bit more later. But the next thing you want to do is click on your matte, hit F to bring up the feather properties of your mask, and I'm going to feather this probably about 10 to 12 pixels, somewhere in that range. That looks pretty good. So if we play this back, we already get an idea about what is happening here. Except we have a pretty big issue here, the button that comes down onto the palm. If you look at the original example, it sort of unfolds. Now I actually opted to not do that with Element 3D just because it happens fairly quickly. I just used a few layers to sort of fake that 3D motion. So I'm going to show you how to do that next. What we need to do is go to the frame when the button first appears. In my case, it's right here. And now we can select our footage layer, hit Control D on the keyboard to duplicate it, and make sure the track matte is changed from alpha matte to no track matte. Now I'm going to right click, choose time, freeze frame. Now select the pen tool, zoom in here, and just draw a mask around the top part of this button. So something sort of like this. And now we can go ahead and duplicate that one more time. Hit M and then select and delete the mask. And this time we're just going to draw a mask around the button. There we go. Now if we solo both of those, you can see what we've done is just isolated them. Except now we need to just change a couple things. So go ahead and select just the button piece. Grab the pan tool up here and move its anchor point to right about at its base where it would be connecting with the rest of this button. And now we can grab the rest of it and move its anchor point to the top part of it. Now parent the button to the top part so that way if we want to rotate it, it looks something like that. So we can go ahead and unsolo both of these, and now let's hold Shift to select them both and then hit P Shift R to bring up both the position and rotation value for both of the layers. Now right here on the frame where the button first appears on the palm, I'm going to create a keyframe for all of those values. Now I'm going to move backwards in time just a little bit, probably to say right about here, and I'm going to rotate the top part of the button, bringing the bottom part with it, probably about here, and then I'm going to move both of them down, probably right about there. And now I'm going to select just this circular piece, and we can rotate it about 180 degrees, maybe something about like that. And now if you play this back, you can see kind of what it's doing, except we have an issue. If you keep moving forward in time, you can see that now it just sits still and it looks really odd. So we need to make sure that these layers shut off on this frame. So again, hold Shift to select them both and then hit Alt, close bracket in order to trim them. And then I'm going to go to this frame right here where the animation starts, and I'm going to have these layers start here as well. So hit Alt, open bracket. So now the layers have been trimmed to just this short period of time. Now we have a little bit more refining to do. The first thing I want to change is I actually don't want this top part of the button to come in and resolve at the same time as the bottom part. I want the bottom part to sort of fall the rest of the way down once this lever sort of touches my palm. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and just grab the lever portion and drag its keyframes in just by one. So that way it touches down, and then one frame later, the button touches down. It kind of makes it look a little bit more reactive. Now we have an issue here where you can see the edge where it's broken between these two. But because this animation is so quick, it's all right if we're a little bit sloppy with our keyframes, so we can go ahead and just go frame by frame and make sure to fix those issues. So I'm gonna move that down. Let's go forward. And right here, it needs to be up a little bit more. And then looks like that just about solved it. Let's also check for the top lever, see if there's any issues there. Yeah, right here it looks like it's a little bit high, so I'm going to go forward, set a keyframe for its end position, move back, and at this point I'm going to move it down just a little bit so it lines up with the rest of the web shooter. That's looking really good to me so far. So now what we need to do is just make sure that this portion of the button is not visible, obviously through the hand. With this bottom piece selected, I'm going to grab the pen tool, and I'm just going to draw a rough shape around my thumb, something about like that, just so it covers up the portion of the lever. Now we can go ahead and hit M on the keyboard to bring up the mask properties. And I want to do two things. First, set a keyframe for the mask path, and then change it to subtract. So that way it's going to be cutting off the portion of the button that shouldn't be visible to us quite yet. And now we can use page down on the keyboard to move forward a frame. And then we can adjust this mask. So I'm going to move it back to say right about here. And now we can go forward another frame, and we're just going to go through and make sure that this lines up with the web shooter for the entirety of its animation. All right, that looks really good. And now we get to do the same thing, but just for this top button part. Again, grab the pen tool with that layer selected, draw a mask around the portion of the thumb that should be blocking it. Hit M on the keyboard to bring up the mask properties, set a keyframe for path, set it to subtract, and now we can go frame by frame doing the exact same thing. And it looked like only one frame there needed some cleaning up, so that should be just fine. Now I actually want to add a feather of just a couple pixels, maybe 2, to both of those occluding masks, so that way it just looks a little bit more organic. And now make sure that the motion blur is turned on for the composition and both of our layers. So that way, again, it looks a little bit more organic with the rest of the movement. And if we play this back, it should look something like that. So at this point in time, this is about what you should have completed already, which means it's time to start incorporating some Element 3D in order to finish this up and make it look a little bit more mechanical. So what we need to do is go ahead and create a new solid. I'm going to call this one Element 3D as usual, and I'm going to add element to it using Effects Console, of course, and we're going to go into the scene setup. I'm going to be using a piece from the machine parts of the very first motion design pack. Now, you don't have to use this part. As you can see, it's fairly simple and could probably be created with just a few box primitives inside of Element, or maybe in a different 3D modeling application. Or I bet you could probably find something cool and similar looking online on like TurboSquid or something, but again, just for the sake of the tutorial, this is the piece I'm going to be using. So what I'm going to do is click on the group folder, scroll down until you see group symmetry, and make sure the x-axis is checked on. So now what we can do is select our machine part, and then hit Control D to duplicate it, move the second copy out so there's no gap, something just about like that, and then duplicate it one more time and move the third copy all the way out to roughly about the same position. And what you should be left with is this. Now what we're going to do is create a new plane, and then we're going to rotate the plane 90 degrees and then scale it up so that way it covers the entire back of all of these pieces. We can actually push it back in Z space just a little. And now we need to make sure that a matte shadow material is applied to the plane so that way it's not visible, but it's just going to catch the shadows that come off of these machine parts. And now what you want to do is select the innermost part, which is the bottom one, and turn on the auxiliary animation to channel 1, the middle part to channel 2, and the outermost part to channel 3. And then we're going to set the plane onto channel 4. Now we can go ahead and click OK. Now I'm going to go ahead just to make this easier and solo my Element 3D layer just so we're looking at it by itself. Now if you toggle open group 1 and go to the auxiliary channel dropdown, you can see the information for the channels that we've set. So I'm going to go into channel 1 and set a keyframe for the Z position and also the Y rotation. And I'm going to do this for each of the 3 channels that we've selected. So Z position, Y rotation, and for channel 3, Z position and Y rotation. Now if you select the Element 3D layer and hit U on the keyboard, you can see the keyframe information for each one of these values that we've selected. Now I'm going to zoom in here on the timeline just a little to make this easier, and I'm going to move all of these keyframes forward 3 frames. 1, 2, 3. And now for the beginning of this animation, I need to move them back in Z space so they're hidden behind the plane. So I think about 0.2 will do, so let's go through each one of these, giving it a value of 0.2. Then I also want to flip each one of these over, so 180 degrees on the Y rotation of each one of these. And then the last thing we want to do is offset each of these keyframe sets by 1 frame. So grab all of them but the top one, move it over. All of them but the top one again, move it over, and just keep going down the line until what you're left with is this. Now if you play that back, what you have is this cool unfolding animation. This is going to work really well for hiding the seams on our web shooter animation. So let's go ahead and do that. What we need to do is zoom out here on the timeline, go ahead and unsolo your Element 3D layer, and let's move forward in time until just about the point when the web shooter is about to start transforming on. It's this frame here, you can tell by where the footage layer starts, and I'm going to move all these keyframes over to that point. So there we go. And now what I want to do is in group 1 here of the Element 3D layer, go down to create group null, and let's create a null for this group. I also want to go ahead and create a camera while we're at it. I shot this on my 50mm lens, so might as well be accurate and set that to 50mm. And I'm going to rename this group null to transform 1. And now we can go ahead with lining this up with the web shooter. So I'm going to hit R with transform 1 selected, and let's rotate it back over to the left a little bit, maybe up a little bit. Now let's move this up and over. I'm going to scale it down, hit S on the keyboard to bring up the scale properties. And let's go forward here. That looks like a pretty good size. So right here on this frame where you have it lined up, go ahead and parent your Element 3D layer, not your transform layer. Make sure that that's the Element 3D layer you have selected, and parent it to your null 1. So that way it sticks to the arm pretty well. All right, now this next part is something that you're just going to have to eyeball yourself. The way we set up this animation, it unfolds flat, but we actually need it to unfold into more of a curved shape. We need to go to the rotation keyframe of, say, the second one and change it from 0 to something a little bit beyond that. Maybe negative 17, that looks pretty good in my case. And then to the last frame, and change that rotation to something maybe more like negative 20. And I'm also going to move it down just a touch more. And now go ahead and select your Element 3D layer, toggle open channel 4 because that's the channel we put the plane on, and set a keyframe for the Z position. Move forward 2 or 3 frames, and move channel 4 upward. So that way it completely covers the entire animation. And what you're left with should be something about like that. All right, now we need to do our best to make this Element 3D layer match the web shooter that is beneath it. So there's a couple tricks. The first one I'm going to do is not necessarily a great practice, but it's a good way to make this small piece match the scene quickly. So I'm going to go to my Element 3D layer, scroll down here to the custom layers, and underneath custom texture maps, set layer 1 to be our footage layer. Now we can go to the scene setup, and we're going to change the environment to our custom layer 1. So that way our environment is now taking its information from our footage layer. Now before we click OK, we also need to put a material onto these pieces so they'll closely match the web shooter. I found that the plastic scratches from the Pro Shaders 2 pack works pretty well in this case, so I'm going to go ahead and just assign that to each one of these. And now we can go ahead and click OK. So now we need to add some lights to our scene. There are two main sources you can see, the soft window to my left and the sort of orange colored light that my kitchen is producing. So we're gonna do our best to make those in After Effects. Go to Layer, New, Light, and this orange color is gonna do just fine for the light above. So click OK. And now we're gonna move the light up above the Element 3D layer and move its point of interest down so that way it's pointing in the correct direction. Now we can go Layer, New, Light for our second one. Make this one slightly blue because it's going to be coming from the window. And we can click OK, that's gonna do just fine. Move this one over to the left, and its point of interest back towards the Element 3D layer just as before, and that's looking pretty good. Now let's go to the render settings of our Element 3D layer, find ambient occlusion, mine was already toggled open, and turn that on. Now I like to set it to ray trace just because I think it looks a lot better, however it's going to be pretty intense, so let's turn down the intensity as well as the spread. Let's pull that back. That looks pretty good to me. Now the last thing to do is make it match the color and the grain of the scene. So I'd like to add a levels adjustment to the element layer. And I'm actually gonna go forward here just so you can see them both together a little bit better. So that's a pretty good example. So I'm gonna zoom in just so they pretty much fill up my entire screen. And I'm gonna change the channel to just view the red channel only. And now change your levels to just edit the red channel only. And we can play with this until they look about equal. That looks pretty good. Now same for the green. And now same for the blue. All right, that looks pretty good. That matches really well. So let's go ahead and turn on the motion blur for our Element 3D layer. And let's also add a grain effect. So type in Add Grain. Set this to Final Output. And I'm going to change the intensity down to about 0.2 and the size down to about 0.6. So if you play this back, this is what you're left with so far. However, now we've only taken care of the top unfolding animation. There's also going to be one taking place here down on the side. And also, as the arm rotates over, I want to add another one right here to where the web shooter is closing, which means what we just did, we need to do 2 more times. Now the quickest and easiest way to do that is to grab your Element 3D layer, hit Ctrl D on the keyboard to duplicate it, except that creates a problem. The group null that we made earlier now controls both of them when we only want it to control the old one. Now the way to fix that is to grab your new element layer, scroll down to the group utilities of group 1 and click Unlink. Now the bad news is that completely resets its transform information, but the good news is we can create a new group null now. So I'm going to go ahead and name this group null transform 2. And just to make it easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and select the first transform null, hit P, Shift R, Shift S to bring up its position, scale, and rotation information. Select by holding Control all the values that I want to copy. Hit Control C, select transform 2, and hit Control V. So now it's back where it started, except it's on its own independent null. And now just for sake of organization, I'm going to rename this one to Element 3D 2. I'm going to grab it and the Transform 2 and give them their own color. How about peach? That's pretty cute. And now we can go ahead and start lining up the second iteration of Element. Let's unsolo these real quick. Using its Transform null so that way it fits not on the top, but along the side of the arm. And once you're finished with that, you'll need to go through a third time and add it again to this top part so that way it hides this seam. Now the whole point with this is just to hide the seams, so that way it's not visible that this is just a fade on effect and it actually looks like it has some depth and some real transformation to it. But now that you guys have seen all the steps necessary to create this top piece, I'm not going to go through and make you watch me do both the side and the backhand side of this web shooter because they're virtually the exact same. The only thing you need to remember is that with this new element layer, you can select it and hit U, and you'll need to reposition where all these keyframes are. So obviously, this first one's not going to transform at the same time as the second. So the second one needs to start a little bit later. So somewhere maybe right about here. And then again, the third one, once you duplicate this a third time, will need to start even later than that. The other thing you may want to do is while you're putting in this next Element 3D layer and lining it up with the side, you might find that the mask doesn't quite line up with the edge of your transformation, but that's totally fine. That's why we created the matte the way we did. You can just come in here to the path information of this matte layer, the way that it draws on this web shooter, and just adjust it as needed. So that way you can hide or reveal the seam to your liking. But as you're going through and adding in your transforming element 3D layers, just make sure that you're doing your best to hide these seams, and you can always adjust the mask as needed and play with the keyframes on these element layers as much as you want. Just be creative with it, make sure to take your time, and the end result should look pretty cool. Now, the webbing in this effect is actually the exact same technique as my other Element 3D tutorial. So if you're curious how to do it, you can go ahead and go check that out. The link will be in the description below. But as always, if you have any questions about finishing up this effect or anything that you didn't quite understand, feel free to leave me a comment or reach out to me on Twitter. I'm always happy to help anyone out. But thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like if you learned something and consider subscribing.